Hello friends. Welcome back. Around 20,000 years ago, ice sheets more than 2 miles thick covered much of the northern hemisphere. Entire regions were colder than modern Antarctica, not only in winter, but across the full year. Sea levels stood roughly 120 meters lower than today. Vast shelves of land stretched between continents that are now divided by ocean. Carbon dioxide levels hovered near their lowest point in the last 800,000 years. Plant growth slowed, food chains thinned, human populations were small and scattered. There were no farms, no stored grain, no metal tools, no medicine, no backup. In some regions, a single failed hunt meant starvation within days. A lost fire meant exposure. An untreated injury meant the end of a life. And yet people lived in Siberia, above the Arctic Circle. They camped near advancing glaciers. They crossed land bridges that are now submerged beneath rising seas. The Ice Age was not a single winter. It lasted for thousands of years. Survival was not an act of bravery. It was a system that had to function every single day. Food had to be found. Fire had to be maintained. Shelter had to hold against wind moving across open steppe. Movement decisions had to align with shifting seasons and unstable herds. But how did daily life hold together under that kind of pressure? What did survival actually require beyond strength? How did small groups coordinate food, fire, shelter, and movement without margin for error? And what happened when one of those systems failed? Tonight, we examine what it really took to survive the Ice Age. But before we begin, I'd love to know where on this planet you're tuning in from and what time it is there. I always enjoy seeing how far this little sleepy corner of science reaches. And if you enjoy slowly drifting into stories about science, then a like and a subscribe would mean the world to me. Now, take a deep breath, let your shoulders relax, and together we will trace the fragile systems that allowed human life to persist through the coldest test it ever faced. Cold does not arrive as a single sensation. It settles into averages, into background conditions that quietly reshape everything living beneath the sky. During the height of the last glacial maximum, global temperatures rested roughly 10 to 15 degrees Celsius lower than those of the present world. That difference, modest on paper, translated into vast transformations across continents. Snow that once melted in spring lingered through summer. Rivers that now run freely slowed beneath long skins of ice. Entire belts of forest withdrew, replaced by open grassland and sparse shrub stretching toward a pale horizon. Climate was not uniform across this altered planet. South of the great ice sheets lay the Mammoth Steppe, a dry, wind-exposed expanse that combined cold with aridity. Grasses survived there, but they grew close to the ground, hugging soil that remained locked in permafrost for most of the year. Farther north, tundra zones supported mosses, lichens, and low shrubs adapted to brief summers and dim light. Beyond them rose the glacial interiors themselves, domes of ice, thousands of meters thick, where precipitation fell lightly and accumulated slowly, compressed over centuries into blue-white mass. Each region carried its own rhythm of survival, shaped by temperature, moisture, and the angle of the sun. The ice sheets did more than sit upon the land. Their immense height redirected atmospheric circulation, bending the jet stream and intensifying pressure gradients. Storm tracks shifted southward in open corridors between ice and mountain. Winds accelerated, sweeping across plains with little obstruction. Fine sediment lifted easily from exposed continental shelves and dry riverbeds, carried aloft as dust that veiled the sky and settled over distant valleys. Ice cores from Greenland and Antarctica preserved these particles in layered record, evidence of an atmosphere far more burdened with mineral haze than today. Carbon dioxide levels hovered near their lowest concentration in hundreds of thousands of years. With less of this greenhouse gas to trap heat, global cooling deepened. Plant productivity declined in many regions, narrowing the base of terrestrial food webs. Growing seasons shortened to narrow windows when thaw briefly softened the ground. In some landscapes, frost could return within weeks of initial melt, compressing the cycle of germination, flowering, and seed into a fragile interval. Seasonal contrast sharpened. Winters lengthened into prolonged darkness at high latitudes, while summers, though brighter, remained cool and fleeting. The climate was not merely colder, it was more volatile at the edges, more austere in its allowances. Under such conditions, life persisted within tight margins, calibrated to a world where warmth was temporary, and every season carried the memory of ice. Maps from that distant age would not resemble the outlines now memorized in classrooms. Coastlines stretched outward, seas withdrew, and continents leaned closer together across corridors of wind-carved earth. Where northern Canada now holds forests and lakes, an immense ice sheet pressed downward, its weight deforming crust and flattening ancient terrain beneath a cold, luminous expanse across Scandinavia and much of northern Europe. A sister mass spread outward from mountain cores, flowing slowly over valleys and burying familiar landmarks beneath layered accumulation that advanced and retreated with subtle pulses of climate. Beyond these frozen crowns, land emerged from lowered oceans. Between northeastern Asia and northwestern North America lay Bingia, not a narrow crossing, but a broad subcontinent of grass, shrub, and braided rivers. Herds moved across it, following seasonal growth, and with them traveled small human groups, stepping across what would later become open water. Far to the west, the floor of the North Sea stood exposed as Doggerland, a mosaic of wetlands, rolling hills, and freshwater channels linking Britain to mainland Europe. Archaeological traces, now dredged from submerged sediments, suggest that this landscape once carried forests and camps, then gradually surrendered to rising tides as the deep freeze eased. In Southeast Asia, continental shelves formed a vast extension known today as Sunderland, connecting islands that are now separated by shallow seas. Rivers extended far beyond their present mouths, cutting through plains that have since vanished beneath warm returning waters. These altered coastlines reshaped migration possibilities. Routes that once required boats could be walked, and territories now isolated were once continuous. Glacial forces reorganized drainage across much of the northern hemisphere. Ice blocked established valleys, diverting rivers into new courses that carved unfamiliar paths. Meltwater gathered along the margins of ice sheets, forming proglacial lakes of remarkable scale. When natural ice dams failed, torrent surged outward, sculpting wide spillways and depositing thick layers of sediment downstream. Channels braided and rebraided across exposed plains, shifting with seasonal thaw and refreeze. Topography became both barrier and guide. Mountain passes opened during warmer intervals and sealed again under renewed snowfall. Steppe corridors threaded between ice fronts and uplands, offering narrow belts where game and people could move with relative continuity. But in other regions, advancing ice created coldest sacks of land, where groups might linger for generations, bounded by frozen walls on one side and arid expanses on the other. The geography of that era was not static. It breathed slowly, expanding and contracting with each climatic fluctuation, and within its changing outlines, human pathways were drawn, erased, and drawn again, in patient response to a world still in motion. Not every stretch of land invited footsteps. Even in a world already shaped by cold and shifting coastlines, there were boundaries beyond which human bodies could not reliably function. Habitable space narrowed into belts, defined by temperature, freshwater access, vegetation, and the movement of animals. North of certain latitudes, ice dominated the surface and offered little beyond glare and wind. Deep within glaciated interiors, there was no stable fuel, no forage, no consistent prey. Survival required margins where ecological systems, though strained, still produced enough to sustain another. Across southern Europe, valleys sheltered from the harshest atmospheric circulation became intermittent havens. Limestone caves in regions that are now France and Spain preserve layers of occupation, charcoal, bone fragments, and stone tools embedded in sediment that accumulated slowly over generations. These sites were not random stops, but places returned to repeatedly, suggesting memory carried through time. In Central Asia, along river corridors that cut through steppe and semi-arid plains, campsites appear in clusters, indicating seasonal aggregation when herds migrated through predictable routes. Farther east in Siberia, above the Arctic Circle, archaeological remains testify to human presence in landscapes where winter light dwindled and temperatures remained severe. Their adaptation relied on precise knowledge of terrain, ice stability, and animal behavior. Habitable zones were rarely permanent. Groups moved in rhythms shaped by thaw and freeze, by quivering seasons, by the availability of fish in rivers swollen with meltwater. Seasonal mobility reduced pressure on local resources and allowed small populations to distribute risk across larger territories. Some locations functioned as nodes within wider circuits, revisited each year when conditions aligned. Hearth residues, tool fragments, and patterned debris reveal continuity rather than accidental passage. Certain regions were consistently avoided. The immediate margins of expanding ice sheets posed hazards from creases and unstable meltwater channels. Winds intensified across open forefields, stripping away snow and exposing frozen ground inhospitable to plant growth. In these zones, prey density dropped and shelter options diminished. Human absence in such areas, visible in the archaeological record, reflects not ignorance but selection. Energy budgets left little room for experimentation in landscapes that offered minimal return during the harshest climatic intervals. Refugia emerged where microclimates softened extremes. Southern peninsulas of Europe, parts of the Caucasus, and sheltered basins in Central Asia retained more stable vegetation and freshwater sources. Pollen records and fondal assemblages indicate relatively richer ecosystems in these pockets capable of supporting continuous occupation when surrounding territories grew untenable. Within such refuse, cultural practices could persist, technologies could be maintained, and social networks could endure across generations. Human habitation during this era was therefore neither uniform nor accidental. It traced the contours of possibility, settling where ecological systems remained just sufficient, withdrawing when thresholds were crossed, and returning when balance briefly reappeared. Before food could be prepared or tools repaired, space itself had to be shaped into protection. Shelter was not an afterthought to survival. It was a deliberate act of engineering, carried out with materials at hand and an intimate, measured understanding of wind, ground, and season. In regions where limestone cliffs rose above valleys, caves and rock overhangs offered immediate relief from exposure. Their stone ceilings trapped warmer air from hearths. Their walls reduced convective heat loss, and their entrances could be partially screened with hides to moderate drafts. Within such spaces, repeated occupation left layered sediments of ash, charcoal, and fragmented bone, quiet testimony to generations who returned to the same protective hollows. Where natural formations were absent, construction became necessary. Across parts of Eastern Europe, archaeologists have uncovered circular arrangements of mammoth bones, tusks interlocked, and ribs set upright, forming frameworks that once supported coverings of hide. These dwellings, positioned on elevated ground to avoid meltwater pooling, reveal planning beyond a single night's rest. The mass of bone provided structural stability against persistent winds sweeping across open plains. Over this framework, layered skins created a barrier against radiant heat loss, while internal partitions likely reduced interior volume, conserving warmth generated by bodies and fire. Hide-covered shelters required continuous maintenance. Animal skins had to be scraped, dried, and treated to prevent stiffness in freezing temperatures. Stitching marks preserved in rare impressions suggest careful tailoring, allowing coverings to overlap and shed precipitation. Entrances were often oriented away from prevailing winds, a small adjustment with significant thermal consequences. Around the perimeter, snow or packed earth could be banked as additional insulation, sealing gaps where cold air might infiltrate. Inside these dwellings, hearth placement was precise. Fire pits were positioned centrally or slightly offset, balancing heat distribution with smoke ventilation. Charcoal concentrations indicate controlled burning rather than uncontrolled blaze. Stones, when available, were sometimes arranged around flames to absorb and slowly radiate warmth. The ceiling height, whether rock or hide, supported by bone, influenced airflow, allowing smoke to accumulate above head level before escaping through intentional openings. Seasonal camps varied in complexity. During milder intervals, lighter structures sufficed, perhaps simple windbreaks constructed from brush and hide. In colder phases, more substantial dwellings appeared, suggesting longer occupation and greater investment of labor. The choice of location reflected awareness of microtopography, slight depressions sheltered from wind, proximity to fresh water, and access to fuel all shaped placement decisions. Shelter in this world was an evolving practice, refined through observation and memory. It translated environmental constraint into livable interior space, creating pockets of moderated climate within a broader landscape of cold. Within those constructed boundaries, daily routines could unfold with a measure of stability, even as the air beyond remained unforgiving. Flame in that long-wintered world was never casual. It demanded attention the way breathing does, constant and unbroken. Within sheltered spaces carved from stone or raised from bone and hide, embers were guarded as carefully as food. Ash layers preserved in ancient floors reveal hearths rebuilt in the same shallow depressions, charcoal renewing itself in quiet succession. The pattern suggests continuity rather than accident, a rhythm of tending that extended through nights when temperatures pressed far below comfort, and into mornings when frost lingered along every surface. Fuel determined how long warmth could persist. In forested refuges, wood offered steady combustion, yet across open steppe and paraglacial plains, trees were sparse or entirely absent. There, driftwood, carried by distant rivers, fragments of dwarf shrubs, and dried grasses provided limited burn time. Archaeological remains from certain Eastern European sites show extensive use of large, mammal bones within hearths. Long bones, once stripped of marrow, were placed into fire, where their fatty residues sustained combustion. The scent would have been sharp, the heat intense, but uneven. Yet it was sufficient to extend the life of embers when wood was scarce. Continuous maintenance meant planning beyond the present hour. Coals were banked beneath ash to slow oxygen flow, preserving heat through periods when fuel was limited. Stones arranged around the fire pit absorbed warmth and released it gradually, moderating interior temperature. The floor around a hearth often bears evidence of repeated cleaning, suggesting careful management to prevent uncontrolled spread within confined dwellings. Fire was both protection and risk, a contained force that required discipline. Ignition technologies reveal further intention. Flint struck against iron-rich minerals, such as pyite, produced sparks capable of catching on prepared tinder. Charred plant fibers, or dried fungal material collected and stored for this purpose, increased the probability of success. The act of striking stone against stone in frigid air demanded dexterity and patience, particularly when fingers stiffened from cold. The ability to generate flame anew reduced dependence on existing embers. Yet even with such tools, success was never guaranteed. Beyond warmth, fire altered daily survival in subtle ways. Wet hides and garments heavy with melted frost could be dried and softened near controlled heat, restoring insulation. Stone tools warmed beside the hearth became less brittle and easier to handle. Meat could be cooked to reduce pathogen load. Marrow rendered more accessible, and bones fractured with greater efficiency once heated. In sub-zero climates, the loss of fire carried cascading consequences. Without heat, interior temperatures fell quickly toward ambient air. Moisture within clothing refroze. Sleep became fragmented by shivering. The energy required to maintain core body temperature rose sharply, drawing upon already limited caloric reserves. Within such conditions, the small circle of light at the center of camp was not symbolic comfort, but a functional boundary between endurance and decline, sustained through vigilance and shared responsibility. Warmth did not belong only to structures of stone or hide. It traveled with the body, stitched close to skin and shaped by careful hands. In sediments preserved by frost and time, slender bone needles have been recovered, their eyes drilled with deliberate precision. These tools, worn smooth from repeated use, suggest garments assembled from fitted pieces rather than loosely draped skins. Tailoring allowed material to contour to shoulders, elbows, knees, reducing gaps where heat might escape and preventing excess fabric from catching wind. Each puncture of hide required force and patience, each seam a quiet investment in survival. Animal skins formed the foundation of this portable shelter. Large herbivores provided thick hides capable of blocking wind, while smaller mammals offered dense fur that trapped air in fine layers. The insulating quality of fur arises from this captured air, a barrier that slows convective heat loss and preserves the warmth generated by metabolism. When arranged in multiple layers with fur turned inward against the body or outward to shed snow, depending on condition, clothing functioned as a dynamic system responsive to weather. Moisture management became critical. Damp fur loses loft and therefore insulating capacity, so garments had to be dried regularly and protected from saturation. Footwear required special attention in frozen landscapes. Direct contact with snow or ice rapidly conducts heat away from extremities, increasing risk of frost injury. Archaeological impressions and ethnographic parallels indicate boots, constructed from soft hide, sometimes lined with fur and filled with insulating plant fibers or dry grass. Flexible soles allowed movement across uneven terrain, while additional wrapping around the ankle reduced infiltration of snow. Such designs balanced warmth with mobility, preserving the dexterity necessary for travel and hunting. Unlike cold-adapted mammals, whose physiology includes thick subcutaneous fat and seasonally dense coats, humans relied primarily on cultural innovation. The body alone, relatively hairless and metabolically constrained, could not withstand prolonged exposure without assistance. Clothing extended the thermal envelope of the species, transforming fragile skin into a layered interface between internal heat and external cold. In this sense, garments were not mere accessories, but technological adaptations comparable to tools and shelters. The production of clothing carried significant energetic cost. Hunting supplied raw material, yet hides required scraping, stretching, and curing before they could be worn. Fat and brains were often used in tanning processes to soften fibers, demanding additional labor and resources. Sewing consumed time that might otherwise be spent gathering fuel or tracking prey. Nevertheless, the caloric expense invested in garments yielded long-term returns by reducing heat loss and conserving metabolic energy during rest and movement. Clothing then became a mobile architecture, enclosing the body in crafted insulation. Through layered fur, fitted seams, and carefully designed footwear, humans reshaped their immediate microclimate, carrying with them a buffer against the relentless gradient between living warmth and surrounding cold. Energy in that frozen age was counted not in abstract measures, but in warmth retained, distance traveled, and nights endured without trembling. The human body maintains a narrow internal temperature, and when surrounding air falls far below that threshold, metabolism accelerates to compensate. Thermoregulation becomes an unceasing demand, drawing upon stored reserves to sustain the gradient between living tissue and surrounding cold. In temperate climates, daily caloric needs may rest within moderate bounds, yet in subarctic conditions, those requirements rise substantially, particularly when layered clothing and shelter cannot fully buffer exposure. Estimations drawn from studies of modern Arctic populations suggest that adults engaged in sustained physical activity under cold stress may require several thousand calories per day, often exceeding what would suffice in milder regions. Movement through snow, hauling carcasses, constructing dwellings, and maintaining fuel supplies compound this expenditure. Basal metabolic rate increases as the body shivers or activates brown adipose tissue, processes that generate heat but consume precious energy. Even during rest, heat radiates outward, demanding continual replacement through food intake. Fat emerges within this equation as a dense and efficient resource. Gram for gram, lipids contain more than twice the caloric content of carbohydrates or protein. Animal fat, whether subcutaneous deposits or marrow stored within long bones, offers sustained fuel capable of supporting extended thermogenesis. In the absence of abundant plant carbohydrates during much of the year, reliance on animal sources likely intensified. Ethnographic parallels among Inuit and other high-latitude communities demonstrate the feasibility of diets rich in fat and protein, supporting cognitive function and physical endurance in environments where vegetation remains sparse for long intervals. Prolonged calorie deficit carries measurable consequences. As energy intake falls below expenditure, body mass declines, immune function weakens, and wound healing slows. Muscle tissue may be metabolized to meet immediate needs, reducing strength required for hunting or migration. Skeletal remains from glacial period sites sometimes display markers consistent with nutritional stress, subtle lines in tooth enamel, or altered bone growth patterns, indicating episodes when resources ran thin. Such signals suggest that even well-adapted groups faced intervals when the calorie equation tipped precariously toward loss. Megapa therefore held disproportionate importance. Large herbivores, such as mammoth and bison, provided not only meat, but extensive fat reserves, capable of sustaining multiple individuals over extended periods. A successful hunt could yield thousands of calories in concentrated form, including organ tissues rich in essential fatty acids. Beyond immediate consumption, fat could be rendered and stored, extending its utility beyond the day of capture. In this context, the pursuit of large prey was not solely a matter of prestige or efficiency, but a metabolic strategy aligned with environmental constraint. The balance between intake and expenditure defined survival margins. Each journey across frozen ground, each hour spent in pursuit, entered silently into an accounting system governed by physiology. Within that system, fat-rich resources and disciplined energy management allowed small groups to persist where ambient cold constantly pressed against the limits of human endurance. Across windswept plains and along river corridors edged with frost-hardened ground, survival often depended on the movement of other lives. Herd animals traced seasonal circuits across steppe and tundra, their migrations patterned, yet never entirely predictable. Mammoth moved in family groups, immense and deliberate, their thick hides and stored fat, representing concentrated energy against a sparse horizon. Reindeer traveled in flowing columns that could stretch beyond sight, hooves cutting dark lines through crusted snow. Bison clustered along sheltered valleys, where grasses persisted beneath ice-rimmed soil. These animals were not simply prey, they were moving reservoirs of calories, warmth, and material. Hunting them required coordination beyond individual strength. Archaeological evidence from sites scattered across Eurasia reveals accumulations of bones, arranged in ways that suggest planned drives and ambushes. Certain kill sites show clusters of skeletal remains from multiple individuals of the same species, implying episodes when groups directed herds toward natural bottlenecks such as ravines or soft ground near water. Cooperation increased probability of success and distributed risk among participants. Roles likely varied, with some individuals driving animals, while others waited at strategic positions, tools prepared. Stone-tipped spears formed the core of this effort. Carefully shaped points, hafted onto wooden shafts, were designed to penetrate thick hide and muscle. In some regions, evidence suggests the use of spear throwers, devices that extend the arm and amplify velocity, increasing both range and impact force. Such tools required skill to produce and maintain their effectiveness, dependent on balance and sharpness. Repeated resharpening marks, preserved on recovered points, indicate continual upkeep, a quiet reminder that preparation preceded confrontation. Tracking demanded attentiveness to subtle signs. Hoof impressions in snow revealed direction and group size. Compressed grasses on open ground indicated recent passage. Wind could erase traces quickly, and snowfall might conceal them entirely. Hunters learned to read disturbances in surface texture, to interpret broken stems or displaced soil as fragments of a larger pattern. Patience often replaced haste, conserving energy until opportunity aligned. The risks were substantial. Large herbivores, though not predators, could inflict severe injury when cornered. A single misjudged approach might result in trampling or goring, compromising mobility in an environment where movement equaled survival. Skeletal remains from certain archaeological contexts display fractures consistent with blunt force trauma, some healed, others likely fatal. These marks suggest that hunting success carried physical cost. Butchering practices reveal further complexity. Cut marks on bones indicate systematic removal of muscle, extraction of marrow, and separation of joints. Carcasses were processed efficiently, maximizing yield from each kill. In some locations, specific body parts appear transported, while others were left behind, implying decisions shaped by distance to camp and weight constraints. Hunting in this frozen world was therefore not a singular event, but an integrated sequence from tracking and coordination to processing and distribution, each stage woven into the broader fabric of survival. Not every pursuit ended in success. Across long stretches of steppe and valley, there were days when tracks dissolved into wind-scoured ground, when herds shifted direction beyond reach, when weapons returned unused. In such intervals, uncertainty settled over camp, not as panic, but as arithmetic. Energy spent had to be weighed against energy remaining. The rhythm of pursuit and return, so vital to continuity, occasionally faltered. Hunting in glacial landscapes was shaped by variability. Herd migrations fluctuated with subtle changes in weather and forage. Storms could disperse animals or obscure signs of passage. Injury, fatigue, or simple miscalculation altered outcomes. The archaeological record reflects this unpredictability. Some occupation layers contain abundant fossil remains, while others hold sparse fragments, suggesting cycles of plenty and scarcity rather than constant yield. When primary prey eluded capture, alternative strategies emerged. Scavenging likely formed part of this adaptive repertoire. Large carnivores left partially consumed carcasses on open ground, and human groups equipped with tools and coordination could appropriate remaining tissue and marrow. Cut marks overlying tooth impressions on certain bones indicate such overlap, evidence that people sometimes arrived after predators. Smaller game also gained importance during lean phases, including hares, birds, and rodents, whose populations fluctuated less dramatically than megapo. Preservation techniques extended the life of successful hunts. Meat sliced into thin strips could be dried in cold, dry air, especially in regions where low humidity slowed spoilage. Fat, rendered from adipose tissue, might be stored in skin containers or mixed with dried lean meat to form dense transportable provisions. Such practices transformed perishable abundance into delayed security, allowing groups to bridge periods when fresh kills were absent. Storage, however, required foresight and discipline. Consuming all resources immediately risked future deprivation. Despite these measures, prolonged deficit carried physiological cost as body fat diminished, metabolic reserves narrowed, protein breakdown increased to sustain essential processes, leading to muscle wasting and reduced strength. Dental enamel hypoplasia, observed in some skeletal remains, signals episodes of developmental stress during childhood. While certain adult bones display markers associated with nutritional strain, these traces do not narrate individual stories, but collectively suggest that scarcity recurred with enough frequency to leave biological imprint. Starvation in this context was seldom instantaneous. It unfolded gradually, marked by declining endurance and heightened vulnerability to cold and illness. Social mechanisms may have mitigated impact, with resource sharing, distributing risk across households, yet margins remained thin. Each unsuccessful hunt entered into a broader ledger of survival, balanced by stored food, opportunistic gathering, and communal cooperation. Failure, then, was not anomaly, but expected variable within the system. Adaptation required anticipation of absence as much as pursuit of success. Within that awareness lay a tempered resilience, shaped by repetition and memory, guiding decisions in a landscape where certainty was rare, and continuity depended on navigating intervals of want without surrendering cohesion. Along frozen river margins, and beneath the muted light of short winter days, subsistence extended beyond the pursuit of large herds. Where water continued to move beneath ice, another source of protein persisted, quieter yet dependable. Archaeological sites near ancient river channels reveal fish bones clustered among hearth debris, their presence indicating systematic harvesting rather than chance capture. In some regions, carefully shaped barbed points fashioned from bone suggest tools suited for spearing fish through openings cut into surface ice. The act required patience, stillness, and knowledge of seasonal patterns in aquatic life. Rivers and lakes, even in glacial periods, offered microhabitats buffered from the most severe winds. Meltwater streams coursing along ice margins supported fish populations adapted to cold, oxygen-rich conditions. During warmer intervals of the year, spawning runs would have concentrated individuals in shallow channels, increasing accessibility. Coastal communities, situated along then exposed shorelines, encountered marine resources that expanded dietary diversity. Remains of fish, vertebrae, and marine mammal fragments at certain sites point to sustained engagement with littoral ecosystems. Trapping provided another layer of security. Small mammals, such as hares and foxes, whose populations fluctuated with vegetation cycles, could be captured using simple mechanical devices fashioned from wood, sinew, and stone. Though organic components rarely survive in the archaeological record, wear patterns on the record for associated stakes and the spatial arrangement of fondal remains suggest repeated placement along habitual animal paths. Traps functioned passively, continuing to operate while hunters attended to other tasks, thereby diversifying energy acquisition strategies. Bird migrations introduced seasonal abundance. Waterfowl, traveling between breeding and wintering grounds, often gathered in large numbers at wetlands and river mouths. During these periods, eggs and adult birds could be collected with relative efficiency. Cut marks on aven bones recovered from certain European and Siberian sites indicate deliberate processing. The timing of such exploitation required observation across years, aligning human movement with predictable pulses of avine presence. In coastal settings, shellfish represented a further reservoir of sustenance. Shell mittens discovered in some Ice Age contexts contain accumulations of mollusk shells, interspersed with charcoal and stone flakes, suggesting organized harvesting and consumption. Shellfish, though lower in caloric density compared to large mammals, offered reliable protein and micronutrients. Their collection demanded knowledge of tides, seasonal growth cycles, and safe access to intertidal zones. These varied practices illustrate a layered approach to survival. Fishing, trapping, and gathering smaller game reduced dependence on singular, high-risk events. They smoothed fluctuations in food supply, distributing effort across multiple ecological niches within a landscape shaped by cold and variability. Such diversification enhanced resilience, weaving together river, coast, and open ground into a network of modest but steady returns that sustained daily life beyond the dramatic arc of the hunt. In a world defined by ice, water remained both everywhere and not immediately usable. Snow-blanketed ground, rivers locked beneath rigid surfaces, lakes sealed under thick crusts that concealed their depth. Yet the human body continued to require steady hydration, blood volume, cellular function, and temperature regulation all depended upon it. Securing drinkable water became a daily task, woven quietly into movement and camp life. Freshwater sources persisted beneath frozen exteriors. Springs emerging from underground aquifers sometimes flowed even during the coldest months, their relatively constant temperature preventing complete freezing. These locations, modest in size, yet reliable, likely drew repeated visitation. River systems, though capped with ice, often maintained liquid channels below, particularly where current remained strong. Access required breaking through surface layers or locating natural openings near bends and shallow stretches. Such work demanded tools and caution, as ice thickness varied with depth and flow. Snow itself could serve as a source, though not without complication. Consuming unmelted snow lowers core temperature and increases metabolic cost as the body expends energy to warm ingested ice to internal levels. Melting snow near a hearth offered safer hydration, yet required fuel and time. The process also reduced volume substantially. A container filled with snow yields only a fraction of that space in liquid form. This conversion represented another small but consistent energy investment within an already constrained system. During seasonal transitions, glacial meltwater streams braided across landscapes near ice margins. These channels carried mineral-rich runoff, often turbid, with suspended sediment ground from rock by the slow movement of ice. While visually opaque, such water remained potable once sediment settled or was filtered through cloth and plant fibers. Meltwater corridors may have functioned as navigation routes as well, guiding travel and concentrating plant and animal life along their banks. Cold climates mask dehydration. Reduced sweating and lower perceived thirst can obscure fluid loss, even as respiration. Frigid air increases moisture expenditure through breath. Extended physical exertion, combined with limited intake, gradually diminishes plasma volume, impairing endurance and cognitive clarity. In such conditions, maintaining hydration required deliberate awareness rather than reliance on sensation alone. Water sources also carried hazard. Ice near river mouths or melt channels could thin unpredictably, fracturing underweight. Submerged currents beneath frozen surfaces created unstable zones invisible from above. A fall into near-freezing water risked rapid heat loss and compromised mobility. Avoiding such danger demanded familiarity with terrain and seasonal patterns. Thus, within landscapes where frozen water dominated the eye, usable liquid required effort to obtain and discernment to approach. Hydration formed another quiet thread in the fabric of survival, linking physiology to geography in a cycle of daily attention. Long before metal entered human hands, survival depended upon edges shaped from stone, honed with care, and carried across vast distances. In the glacial world, precision was not a luxury, but a requirement. A blade that dulled too quickly wasted energy. A point that fractured at impact risked both prey and hunter. Stone core technologies evolved toward efficiency, producing elongated flakes with sharp margins that could be hafted, resharpened, and replaced as needed. The selection of raw material mattered. Fine-grained flint and fractured predictably, allowing nappers to anticipate the path of each strike, even when fingers stiffened in cold air. Cold conditions altered stone itself. Extreme temperature shifts could increase brittleness, and moisture, trapped within micro-fractars, expanded when frozen. Tools left exposed might degrade or crack. As a result, careful storage within shelters or wrapped in hide likely protected valued implements. Archaeological assemblages often reveal repeated retouching along blade edges, small scars layered upon older ones, indicating cycles of maintenance rather than abandonment. Each retouched edge extended functional life, conserving raw material that might be scarce or distant. Bone and antler complemented stone. These organic materials, derived from hunted animals, provided flexibility where stone offered rigidity. Awls, needles, barbed points, and pressure flakers, fashioned from bone, allowed for fine work, such as sewing garments or shaping other tools. Antler, resilient yet workable, served as a medium for impact tools and spear components. The integration of materials demonstrates a composite technology adapted to multiple demands, each substance contributing distinct mechanical properties. Repair formed an expected rhythm within camp life. Half bindings loosened through use and moisture exposure, requiring tightening or replacement with sinew. Wooden shafts, warped or splintered, especially when subjected to freeze-thaw cycles. Instead of discarding damaged tools, components were replaced selectively. This modular approach reduced waste and preserved investment in labor. Broken spear points might be reworked into smaller implements, transforming failure into renewed function. Mobility introduced further constraint. Toolkits had to be portable, light enough to carry during seasonal movements, yet comprehensive enough to address varied tasks. Evidence from certain sites suggests curated sets of implements transported over long distances, indicating foresight in anticipating future needs. The weight of stone cores, finished blades, and repair materials became part of logistical planning, balanced against food and clothing. Scarcity often stimulates innovation. In regions where high-quality stone was limited, alternative materials or new knapping strategies emerged. Microlathe technologies, producing small standardized inserts set into composite tools, maximized cutting edge from minimal core volume. Such adaptations reflect an intimate dialogue between environment and ingenuity. Under glacial pressure, tools were extensions of thought as much as hand. Their refinement embodied accumulated knowledge transmitted across generations, enabling precise action within a landscape that tolerated little error. Bone remembers what flesh forgets. Long after muscle has returned to soil, fractures remain etched in mineral, subtle lines where force once exceeded resilience. In sites scattered across Eurasia, human skeletons from the glacial world display breaks in ribs, forearms, clavicles, and lower legs. Some fractures are clean and aligned, others irregular, the result of falls, animal encounters, or collisions with unforgiving ground. The distribution of these injuries reflects lives lived in motion across uneven terrain and within proximity to large animals. Yet many of these breaks show signs of healing. Callus formation thickens around once fractured shafts, indicating survival weeks and months beyond the initial trauma. In certain cases, bones knit imperfectly, leaving limbs slightly shortened or joints misaligned. Such evidence implies not only endurance, but care. An injured individual, unable to forage or hunt independently, would have required assistance, whether in food distribution, shelter maintenance, or protection from cold. Healing in such conditions suggests cooperative networks capable of absorbing temporary loss of productivity. Medical options were limited to what could be improvised from available materials and knowledge transmitted orally. Splints fashioned from wood or bone may have stabilized limbs bound with sinew or hide strips. Wounds were perhaps cleaned with water or packed with plant material known to reduce swelling or deter insects during warmer intervals. Without antiseptics or antibiotics, infection posed constant threat. A simple cut, if contaminated, could progress to systemic illness. Skeletal lesions in some remains hint at chronic infection, visible as pitted surfaces or abnormal bone growth, where inflammation once persisted. Cold introduced additional complexity, reduced blood flow to extremities in freezing temperatures, impaired immune response, and slowed healing. Frostbite, though rarely identifiable in ancient remains, likely affected fingers and toes exposed during hunting or travel. Loss of digits would have diminished dexterity, complicating tool use and clothing production. The body's capacity to repair itself required sufficient caloric intake, linking injury directly to the delicate energy balance already strained by climate. Mobility loss carried profound consequence. In landscapes where seasonal movement aligned with resource availability, the inability to travel jeopardized access to food and water. An injured person might remain at a temporary camp while others scouted or hunted, increasing reliance on group cohesion. If injury occurred far from shelter, immediate transport became necessary, demanding strength and coordination from companions. The margin between survival and decline narrowed sharply when locomotion faltered. Pain itself, though invisible in bone, shaped daily experience. Persistent discomfort alters sleep, concentration, and emotional resilience. That ancient communities persisted despite such burdens speaks to adaptive flexibility rather than invulnerability. Fractures that healed, infections that resolved, and lives that continued after trauma reveal a quiet endurance woven through the record of stone and marrow, where the imprint of suffering coexists with evidence of care and collective persistence. Small footprints rarely survive in ancient soil, yet childhood leaves its presence in subtler traces. Within burial sites and scattered habitation layers, the remains of infants and young individuals appear with sobering frequency, suggesting that early life carried profound vulnerability. High infant mortality was likely a constant shadow shaped by infection, nutritional instability, and exposure to cold. In environments where energy balance already strained adults, the additional metabolic demands of pregnancy and lactation intensified risk for mothers and children alike. Gestation during glacial periods required sustained caloric intake at a time when food supply fluctuated. Nutritional stress on expectant mothers could influence fetal development, affecting birth weight and resilience. Skeletal indicators such as enamel hypoplasia, faint horizontal lines across teeth that form during periods of physiological stress, provide glimpses into episodes when nourishment falter during early growth. These markers do not narrate individual hardship, but collectively imply that scarcity intersected with development at critical moments. Breastfeeding likely extended over prolonged intervals, offering both nutrition and immune protection in settings where alternative foods for infants were limited and potentially unsafe. Human milk adapts compositionally to maternal diet and health, yet when maternal reserves decline, production may diminish or alter in quality. In cold climates, the energetic cost of lactation added to the burden of thermorelation, increasing maternal caloric requirements. Extended nursing could space births, indirectly stabilizing group resources by reducing the number of dependent infants at any one time. Development unfolded against environmental pressures distinct from those faced by adults. Infants possess higher surface area relative to body mass, rendering them more susceptible to heat loss. Maintaining warmth required constant attention, including layered clothing scaled to small bodies and positioning near caregivers within sheltered spaces. Ethnographic parallels from high-latitude societies suggest that infants were often kept in close contact with adults, sharing body heat beneath fur garments or within insulated sleeping arrangements. Such proximity not only conserved warmth, but reinforced social bonds critical for cooperative survival. Mobility presented additional risk. Seasonal movements across uneven terrain demanded carrying young children, redistributing physical strain within the group. Falls or exposure during travel could prove fatal for the smallest members. Protective strategies, therefore, extended beyond clothing to include coordinated pacing and route selection, mindful of the most vulnerable. Childhood in this context was neither sheltered from hardship nor devoid of care. Evidence of deliberate infant burials in certain archaeological sites indicates recognition of personhood and grief, suggesting emotional as well as practical investment in young lives. Each surviving child represented continuity, the transmission of accumulated knowledge into another generation. Within a climate that tested resilience daily, the survival of the young required sustained cooperation, nutritional vigilance, and adaptive ingenuity woven quietly into the fabric of communal life. Time marked bodies in ways both subtle and unmistakable. In the glacial world, age did not accumulate gently. It etched itself into enamel, joints, and vertebrae, recording years of strain beneath open skies. Average life expectancy at birth was likely low by modern standards, shaped heavily by infant mortality and episodic scarcity. Yet, those who survived early vulnerability could reach what we would recognize as mature and even advanced age, though such longevity remained uncommon. Skeletal assemblages from Upper Paleolithic contexts reveal adults whose bones carry the signatures of decades of labor, suggesting that aging, while rare, was not absent. Teeth often speak first. Heavy wear on molars ground flat by diets containing grit from stone grinding or wind-blown sediment indicates repeated mechanical stress. In some individuals, enamel eroded enough to expose dentin and abscesses formed where infection entered through worn surfaces. Bones around the spine and major joints display osteoarthritic changes, small bony projections, and smoothed surfaces that signal chronic load-bearing. These patterns imply lifetimes spent walking long distances, lifting weight, and working hides or tools with persistent repetition. Despite physical decline, older individuals appear in burial records and habitation sites, suggesting they were neither abandoned nor systematically excluded. Survival into later years required continued integration within the group. Reduced mobility may have shifted roles from active hunting to tasks compatible with accumulated knowledge, processing food, crafting tools, repairing garments, and caring for children demand experience as much as strength. In communities where environmental margins remained narrow, the memory of seasonal patterns, migration routes, and resource locations held tangible value. Knowledge transmission across generations likely occurred through demonstration and narrative woven into daily practice rather than formal instruction. The techniques required to shape a reliable blade to identify edible plants during brief growing intervals or to anticipate weather shifts near ice margins could not be reinvented, each generation without cost. Elders embodied these lessons, their lived experience functioning as a repository of adaptive strategies refined through trial and observation. Aging, in such a context, was therefore both biological process and social position. Physical wear signaled exposure to cumulative hardship, yet endurance beyond youth conferred a form of authority rooted in memory. The presence of older adults in archaeological contexts suggests that cooperative structures extended support beyond peak physical productivity. In this way, survival was not solely a function of youthful strength, but of continuity, linking accumulated insight with emerging resilience. Through that continuity, small groups sustained coherence across decades of climatic instability, carrying forward practices shaped long before and long after individual lifespans had passed. No individual endured that climate alone for long. The archaeological record, though fragmentary, suggests that human presence during the glacial period clustered in small but structured groups. Hearth distributions, dwelling footprints, and spatial patterns of discarded tools indicate gatherings larger than a single family, yet modest in scale, perhaps numbering in the dozens at most. Such group sizes balanced mobility with mutual support, allowing coordinated effort without exhausting local resources too rapidly. Within these communities, survival depended upon circulation rather than accumulation. Resources acquired through hunting, fishing, or gathering did not remain solely with the individual who secured them. Cut mark distributions and differential transport of carcass parts imply deliberate allocation within camp. Marrow-rich bones and organ tissues dense with energy were likely divided in ways that reflected social bonds and collective need-sharing reduced volatility. When one hunter returned empty-handed, others might compensate. This redistribution softened the sharp edges of environmental unpredictability. Coordinated hunts further illustrate interdependence. Large prey could not be reliably captured by solitary action. Strategic positioning, signaling, and role differentiation enhanced probability of success. Such coordination required communication and trust developed over repeated interaction. Failure to align movement at critical moments could result in injury or lost opportunity. Over time, shared experience, refined technique, embedding cooperation within practice rather than abstract principle. Connections extended beyond immediate camps. Stone materials, sourced from distant geological formations, appear in assemblages far from their origin, indicating long-distance movement or exchange networks linking separate groups. Marine shells found inland and distinctive tool styles replicated across broad regions reinforced this pattern of interaction. These exchanges were not merely economic. They fostered genetic diversity, cultural transmission, and access to information about shifting conditions across the landscape. In a world of climatic instability, knowledge carried across distance increased adaptive flexibility. Isolation, by contrast, amplified risk. A small group cut off from broader networks faced heightened vulnerability to resource shortfall, disease, or demographic imbalance. Limited mating pools could reduce genetic variability, affecting long-term resilience. Social fragmentation might also diminish cumulative knowledge, forcing repeated relearning of survival strategies. The archaeological scarcity of completely isolated sites suggests that even amid vast expanses, humans maintained some degree of connectivity. Cooperation in this context was neither sentimental nor optional. It functioned as infrastructure, invisible yet foundational. Through shared labor, distributed risk, and extended networks, small communities converted individual fragility into collective endurance. The cold pressed equally upon all, yet within shared effort lay a stabilizing force, binding separate lives into systems capable of persisting across seasons that no single body could have withstood alone. Movement in that era was rarely impulsive. It unfolded as measured response to subtle cues carried in wind, vegetation, and animal behavior. Camps did not remain fixed unless conditions allowed it. Instead, human groups traced seasonal circuits across familiar territories, shifting position as temperatures rose or fell, and as herds altered their grazing grounds. Migration was less a singular journey than a patterned rhythm, repeated across years, with variations shaped by weather and resource availability. Following animal herds required anticipatory knowledge. Reindeer, bison, and other prey species did not wander aimlessly, their routes aligned with forage cycles and covering grounds. To remain near these moving sources of sustenance, human communities adjusted their own trajectories. Travel demanded coordination as shelter materials, tools, and children had to be transported without exhausting energy reserves. Each departure from a site represented a calculated trade, balancing diminishing returns against the uncertainty of what lay ahead. Advancing ice fronts added further complexity. Glaciers did not move quickly by human standards, yet their gradual expansion altered river systems and blocked established corridors. Meltwater channels reconfigured landscapes, sometimes isolating previously accessible valleys. Communities living near these shifting margins would have observed subtle environmental signals, changes in wind patterns, soil moisture, and vegetation that indicated long-term transformation. Choosing to relocate before conditions deteriorated fully reduced risk, yet leaving too early forfeited remaining resources. Unknown territories carried their own hazards. Entering unfamiliar terrain meant limited knowledge of freshwater sources, predator presence, or seasonal variability. The cost of misjudgment could be severe. Archaeological evidence suggests that migration often followed existing natural pathways, such as river valleys and coastal plains, features that offered predictable orientation and access to water. Isotopic analysis of human teeth and bones provides additional insight into these patterns. Ratios of certain elements incorporated into skeletal tissue through diet and water consumption vary geographically. Differences in isotopic signatures within a single individual can indicate movement across distinct ecological zones during a lifetime, revealing that mobility was not hypothetical but embedded in biology. Migration decisions, therefore, reflected accumulated experience rather than spontaneous reaction. Elders who remembered prior cycles of abundance and scarcity likely influenced timing. Social ties between neighboring groups may have guided movement toward known refuge during difficult intervals. Yet each journey still involved exposure to the unpredictable, where weather shifts or resource gaps could test preparation. Within this landscape of gradual change, migration functioned as adaptive recalibration. It redistributed pressure, aligned human presence with shifting ecological opportunity, and prevented overextension in any one place. Through measured movement, small communities maintained flexibility, navigating a world whose boundaries were neither fixed nor entirely knowable. The frozen plains were not empty of other hunters. Beyond the reach of camplight, eyes adjusted to darkness, with equal patience and precision. Cave lions moved across open ground with controlled silence, their musculature adapted for sudden acceleration. Wolves traveled in coordinated packs, reading scent and distance with acute awareness. Hyenas, powerful and resilient, followed migratory routes that overlapped with human pathways, drawn to the same concentrations of prey. In this shared terrain, survival unfolded within a network of competing appetites. Carcasses became contested spaces. A large herbivore, brought down by human effort, represented both nourishment and signal. Scent, carried across wind, that could summon opportunistic predators. Tooth marks layered over cut marks on recovered bones provide tangible evidence of sequential access, suggesting that humans and carnivores alternated at kill sites. Sometimes people arrived first, processing meat and marrow before retreating. At other times, scavenging followed in the wake of predators, with stone tools scraping tissue and from bones already fractured by powerful jaws. This dynamic indicates not constant confrontation, but calculated engagement within overlapping territories. Defensive strategies evolved accordingly. Camps were often positioned with visibility in mind, allowing early detection of approaching animals. Tools served dual roles, functional in hunting, yet equally viable as deterrents. Coordinated vocalization and group presence likely amplified perceived threat, reducing the likelihood of direct attack. Archaeological assemblages containing predator bones within human habitation layers suggest moments when defensive encounters resulted in lethal outcomes for the animals, whether through opportunistic hunting or reactive conflict. Fire extended beyond warmth and cooking. It established a perimeter of light and scent that altered animal behavior. Many large carnivores avoid sustained exposure to flame, their caution shaped by instinct and experience. Maintaining embers through night hours therefore provided not only thermal stability, but a psychological boundary that discouraged encroachment. Charcoal concentrations and repeated hearth construction imply that flame was preserved, with awareness of its broader protective function. Despite these measures, risk remained constant. Skeletal remains bearing puncture marks consistent with carnivore bites indicate that encounters occasionally turned fatal. Yet the broader record reveals coexistence rather than eradication. Predator populations persisted alongside human groups for millennia, suggesting adaptive equilibrium rather than unilateral dominance. Competition in this context did not eliminate one side entirely. It structured behavior on both. Humans refined coordination, vigilance, and tool use in response to shared prey landscapes. Carnivores adjusted movement patterns around areas of human presence. Within this ecological web, each species navigated the other's capabilities, responding to scent, sound, and opportunity. Survival depended not solely on climate, but on negotiating space among equally determined lives, where caution and adaptability shaped the boundary between sustenance and danger. Stillness could shift without warning. A landscape that seemed stable beneath pale light might within days harden under descending air masses drawn from distant ice domes. Sudden cold snaps compressed the already narrow margin between tolerable and lethal conditions. Temperature could fall sharply beyond seasonal expectation, freezing exposed water sources and altering animal movement. Such fluctuations were not constant, yet when they arrived, they demanded immediate adjustment in shelter, clothing, and fuel consumption. Blizzards added further strain. Wind-driven snow reduced visibility to a few body lengths, obscuring familiar routes and masking surface hazards. Drifts accumulated against dwellings, increasing insulation on one side while threatening collapse on another. Travel during such storms risked disorientation, and those caught away from camp faced accelerated heat loss. Archaeological sites sometimes show abrupt abandonment layers, thin occupational deposits capped by wind-blown sediment, suggesting moments when severe weather interrupted habitation. Paleoclimatic records extracted from ice cores and lake sediments reveal that glacial climates were punctuated by abrupt events rather than unfolding in uniform progression. Variations in isotopic ratios and trapped gas concentrations indicate rapid shifts in temperature occurring over decades or even shorter intervals. These data suggest that communities experienced not only gradual cooling or warming, but episodes of instability that reshaped ecological patterns within a human lifetime. Food supply responded quickly to such disturbances. A sudden freeze during early growing intervals could suppress plant productivity, limiting forage for herbivores. Herd migrations might alter course or timing, creating gaps in expected availability. Extended snow cover increased the energy expenditure required for animals to graze, potentially reducing population density over successive seasons. For human groups dependent on these prey species, climatic volatility translated into dietary uncertainty. One prominent example of rapid cooling occurred near the end of the last glacial period during a phase known as the Younger Dry. Geological and isotopic evidence indicates that temperatures in parts of the northern hemisphere dropped markedly within a relatively brief span. The mechanisms behind this event likely involve disruptions to ocean circulation, altering heat distribution across latitudes. Though occurring after the peak glacial maximum, the Younger Dryas illustrates the capacity of Earth's climate system to shift swiftly, even against broader warming trends. Within such variability, adaptation required vigilance rather than complacency. Seasonal expectations could not be assumed constant. Communities attentive to subtle environmental signals, changes in animal behavior, wind patterns, or snowpack depth would have been better positioned to respond. Weather extremes did not simply test endurance. They recalibrated the landscape, compressing opportunity in some regions while opening it in others. Survival unfolded within this dynamic atmosphere where the sky itself participated in the ongoing negotiation between stability and change. Silence can press as heavily as wind. In landscapes where horizons stretched wide and seasons narrowed opportunity, the mind carried its own burden alongside the body. Prolonged cold does more than challenge muscle and metabolism. It shapes cognition, mood, and perception. Limited daylight in winter months, repeated exposure to scarcity, and the constant calculation of risk create a background tension that seldom fully resolves. Within such conditions, psychological endurance becomes as essential as physical adaptation. Scarcity amplifies this strain. When food supplies fluctuate and successful hunts alternate with empty returns, uncertainty settles into daily routine. Anticipation of shortage may alter sleep patterns and sharpen vigilance. The body's stress response, mediated by hormonal shifts, supports immediate action yet exacts cost over extended periods. Though ancient physiology cannot be observed directly, skeletal remains sometimes carry indirect signals of chronic strain. Enamel hypoplasia, previously noted in childhood contexts, may also reflect broader community stress during critical developmental windows. Certain patterns of bone remodeling suggest periods when nutrition faltered and recovery required time. Against this backdrop, ritual and symbolic expression emerge in the archaeological record with quiet persistence. In caves across Europe and parts of Asia, walls bear images of animals rendered with deliberate attention to form and movement. Pigments prepared from mineral ochres and charcoal were applied in spaces removed from ordinary habitation, suggesting intentional departure from daily subsistence tasks. The creation of such images required coordination, planning, and shared meaning. While interpretations vary, the existence of cave paintings indicates engagement with representation beyond immediate survival. Symbolic artifacts extend beyond painted walls. Carved figurines, perforated shells, and carefully arranged burials imply a cognitive landscape enriched with narrative and belief. These expressions may have functioned as mechanisms of cohesion, reinforcing group identity and shared understanding. In environments where material stability was limited, symbolic continuity provided another form of structure. Ritual gatherings within enclosed spaces could have strengthened social bonds, aligning individuals through collective experience. The act of painting or storytelling may have offered temporal relief from environmental stress, focusing attention inward rather than outward toward uncertainty. Such practices do not eliminate hardship, yet they reframe it within broader systems of meaning. Psychological resilience, therefore, was not accidental, but cultivated through art, ritual, and shared narrative. Communities maintained coherence amid climatic volatility. The mind, like the body, adapted through cultural innovation. Within dimly lit chambers and around carefully tended hearths, symbolic behavior will a connection across individuals and generations, sustaining identity even as external conditions shifted. In this interplay between environment and imagination, survival encompassed not only calories and shelter, but the capacity to endure internally as well as physically. Light did not arrive evenly across the year. At higher latitudes, the sun traced a low arc even at midday, casting elongated shadows that lingered across frozen ground. As seasons turned toward winter, daylight contracted until it hovered briefly above the horizon before receding again. In some regions, weeks passed with only muted twilight, the sky remaining a dim gradient rather than a full illumination. Such seasonal variation shaped perception of time itself, compressing activity into narrow intervals of brightness. Extended darkness influenced daily routines in subtle yet persistent ways. Tasks that required fine motor control or distant visibility had to be aligned with available light. During prolonged winter periods, outdoor movement decreased, not solely because of cold, but because visual cues diminished. The human circadian rhythm, regulated in part by light exposure, responds to changes in day length. Reduced sunlight can alter sleep patterns and hormonal cycles, influencing mood and alertness. In glacial communities, adaptation likely included flexible schedules, attuned to shifting photoperiods, rather than fixed notions of day and night. Sunlight also plays a physiological role in vitamin synthesis. Ultraviolet radiation enables the production of vitamin D within skin, supporting bone health and immune function. At high latitudes during winter, limited solar intensity constrains this process. Dietary intake of vitamin D-rich foods such as fatty fish and animal organs may have compensated partially for reduced cutaneous production. the reliance on animal-based nutrition already embedded in cold climate survival strategies, thus intersected with light availability in maintaining physiological balance within sheltered spaces. Firelight extended the functional day. Flames provided not only warmth, but illumination sufficient for tool repair, garment maintenance, and shared activity after sunset. The flicker of light against stone or hide created a focal point around which social interaction gathered. In the absence of abundant daylight, this controlled glow established rhythm, marking intervals of rest and work. The sensory environment of firelight differs from sunlight, warmer in hue and limited in range, encouraging proximity among individuals. Circadian shifts under prolonged darkness may have fostered segmented sleep patterns or periods of quiet wakefulness during night hours. Anthropological studies of traditional high-latitude populations suggest that sleep can adapt to seasonal extremes, becoming more fluid when light cues diminish. In glacial contexts, such flexibility would have aligned with communal vigilance, ensuring that fire was tended and potential threats detected. Light and darkness therefore structured both physiology and culture. The waxing and waning of the sun informed movement, diet, sleep, and social gathering. Within this oscillation, human communities calibrated internal rhythms to external cycles, weaving biological necessity with cultural practice in response to a sky that offered abundance in summer and restraint in winter. Illness in the glacial world moved differently than it does in dense cities or agricultural carom. Human groups were small and often dispersed across broad territories, limiting the sustained transmission chains required for many contagious diseases. Pathogens that depend upon large, continuously interacting populations would have struggled to persist. Epidemics, as understood in later historical periods, were unlikely to sweep repeatedly through these scattered communities. Distance itself functioned as a buffer, and mobility reduced prolonged exposure within confined spaces. Yet, absence of crowding did not equal absence of disease. The most immediate threats often arose from within the body's own vulnerabilities. Injuries acquired during hunting, travel, or daily labor could become portals for infection. Without antiseptic techniques or targeted treatments, even minor wounds risked inflammation that might spread to surrounding tissue. Skeletal evidence occasionally preserved signs of osteomyelitis, where infection penetrated bone, leaving characteristic lesions. Such conditions would have caused pain, swelling, and reduced mobility, compounding environmental hardship. Nutritional deficiencies also shaped health outcomes. Diets heavily reliant on animal protein and fat provided dense energy, yet variability in resource availability could lead to intermittent shortages of specific micronutrients. Vitamin deficiencies sometimes manifest in bone changes detectable archaeologically. For example, porous lesions in cranial bones may indicate anemia, while alterations in long bone growth can reflect systemic stress during development. These markers do not confirm precise diagnosis, but suggest that physiological strain left enduring traces. Parasitic exposure formed another dimension of risk. Consuming undercooked meat or drinking untreated water from certain sources could introduce intestinal parasites. Although soft tissue evidence rarely survives from such antiquity, copperlight analyses from later prehistoric contexts reveal eggs of helmets, implying that parasitic infections were part of human ecological reality. Close contact with animals, whether prey or domesticated companions in later periods, facilitated transmission of zoonotic organisms. In glacial times, proximity to carcasses during processing likely increased exposure potential. Dental remains offer particularly rich insight. Caries appear less frequently in populations reliant on low-carbohydrate diets, yet enamel wear, abscesses, and periodontal disease remain evident. Severe dental infection can extend into jawbone, leaving visible cavities and remodeled tissue. Chronic pain from such conditions would have affected eating efficiency and overall health, especially when caloric intake already fluctuated. Disease during the Ice Age therefore operated within a framework distinct from later agricultural societies. Large-scale contagion may have been limited, yet localized infection, nutritional stress, and parasitic burdens persisted. Health outcomes intertwined with environment, diet, and mobility. Even in the absence of dense settlements, the human body navigated continual biological challenges, balancing resilience against the cumulative pressures of cold, labor, and resource variability. Beneath layers of fur and hide, within bodies shaped by cold, another organ demanded steady fuel. The human brain, though modest in mass compared to the rest of the body, consumes a disproportionate share of daily energy. Even at rest, neural tissue requires continuous glucose and fatty acids to sustain electrical signaling, memory formation, and coordination. In environments where temperature regulation already strained metabolic reserves, maintaining cognitive function was not optional, it was integral to survival. Animal fat played a central role in meeting these demands. Adipose tissue from large herbivores provided concentrated calories capable of supporting prolonged thermogenesis and sustained mental activity. Certain fats contain long-chain omega-3 fatty acids, critical components of neuronal membranes. These lipids influence synaptic plasticity, signal transmission efficiency, and inflammatory regulation within the brain. In cold regions where plant-based sources of essential fatty acids were limited for much of the year, reliance on animal-derived nutrients likely filled this biochemical gap. The energetic architecture of the brain imposes specific requirements. Glucose serves as its primary immediate fuel, yet, in periods of limited carbohydrate intake, ketone bodies derived from fat metabolism can partially substitute. This metabolic flexibility allows cognitive processes to continue, even when dietary composition shifts toward higher fat and protein ratios. For Ice Age communities whose access to starchy plants was seasonal and often scarce, such flexibility may have conferred stability in attention, decision-making, and memory during extended hunts or migrations. Ethnographic observations among modern Arctic populations offer comparative insight. Groups such as the Inuit traditionally consumed diets rich in marine mammals and fatty fish, deriving substantial caloric intake from lipids. Studies indicate that despite high fat consumption, cognitive performance remains robust, supported by adaptive metabolic pathways and nutrient composition rich in omega-3 fatty acids. While direct equivalence between ancient and modern communities is inappropriate, these parallels suggest that high-fat diets can sustain both physical endurance and neurological integrity in cold climates. Beyond energy provision, fat serves as insulation and hormonal regulator. Adequate lipid intake supports production of steroid hormones that influence mood, stress response, and reproductive health. In contexts where psychological resilience and coordinated planning were essential, maintaining biochemical balance through diet held tangible consequences. Thus, the pursuit of fat-rich prey extended beyond caloric arithmetic. It nourished the organ responsible for interpreting landscape, recalling migration routes, and refining tool manufacture. Within skulls shaped by evolutionary history, neural circuits operated continuously, requiring dependable substrates drawn from hunted animals. In the quiet exchange between environment and metabolism, fat became not merely sustenance, but cognitive infrastructure, linking dietary ecology with the capacity to think, remember, and adapt within a world defined by cold. Climate does not move in a straight line. It folds back upon itself, each change altering the conditions that produced it. The immense ice sheets that spread across northern continents did more than reflect sunlight into space. Their mass displaced atmospheric circulation and influenced the exchange of heat between ocean and air. When fresh water from melting margins entered the North Atlantic, it diluted surface salinity, reducing the density that drives thermohaline circulation. Slower ocean currents redistributed heat unevenly, cooling some regions while altering precipitation in others. The cryosphere and the ocean entered into quiet dialogue, each adjustment reverberating across hemispheres. Rainfall patterns shifted in response. As ice domes redirected prevailing winds, storm tracks migrated, concentrating moisture in certain latitudes and depriving others. Regions that once supported mixed woodland transitioned toward open grassland or semi-arid steppe. In lower latitudes, monsoon systems weakened or intensified depending on sea surface temperature gradients. Sediment cores extracted from ancient lake beds preserve alternating layers of fine silt and organic matter, recording oscillations between wetter and drier intervals. These changes did not occur in isolation. They cascaded through vegetation and animal distributions. Vegetation responded first to temperature and moisture thresholds. Tree lines retreated southward, or downslope replaced by cold-tolerant shrubs and grasses. Pollen records reveal rapid transitions in plant communities, sometimes within a few generations. As flora shifted, herbivores adjusted grazing routes and population density, influencing predator behavior and human subsistence patterns. Each ecological tier responded to the one below, forming interconnected chains of cause and effect. Dust cycles intensified under glacial conditions. Expanded drylands and exposed continental shelves generated fine mineral particles that wind carried across continents and oceans. Ice cores contained visible bands of dust, thicker during colder, drier phases. This atmospheric loading affected radiative balance by scattering sunlight and seeding cloud formation, potentially reinforcing cooling in some contexts. Dust deposition on ice surfaces also altered albedo, darkening areas and enhancing localized melting during warmer periods, thereby feeding back into glacial dynamics. Ecosystems under such oscillations exhibited instability rather than equilibrium. Species ranges contracted and expanded. Some populations fragmented into isolated refugia, while others thrived temporarily in newly opened niches. The interplay among ice extent, ocean circulation, precipitation, vegetation, and atmospheric dust created a system sensitive to perturbation. Small shifts could amplify through multiple pathways, producing climate variability that was perceptible within human lifetimes. Within this web of feedbacks, human communities navigated landscapes shaped by forces extending far beyond immediate perception. Survival depended not only on responding to local weather, but on adapting to systemic fluctuations embedded in Earth's interconnected processes. The environment was not static backdrop, but active participant, its feedback loops continually adjusting the stage upon which daily life unfolded. Where ice met Earth, the boundary was neither fixed nor silent. The margins of great glaciers formed transitional zones where frozen mass yielded gradually to exposed ground. These edges were dynamic, shaped by seasonal melt and slow advance, creating landscapes of braided channels, sediment ridges, and shifting pools. Living near such frontiers offered both opportunity and danger, a proximity to change that demanded constant observation. Meltwater ecosystems flourished along these margins. As sunlight warmed the surface during seasonal peaks, streams emerged from beneath ice walls, carrying mineral-rich water across gravel plains. These channels supported hardy vegetation that took root in freshly deposited silt. Grasses and low shrubs established quickly in nutrient-laden soils, attracting herbivores seeking early forage. In turn, predators and human groups followed, drawn by the concentration of life at the meeting point of ice and thaw. Fish occupied colder meltwater streams, and migratory birds paused at newly formed wetlands. The glacial edge thus became a corridor of relative abundance within a broader, austere environment. Yet instability accompanied this productivity. Ice fronts were prone to collapse as internal stresses accumulated. Sections of glacier could cave suddenly, releasing torrents of water and debris. Outburst floods generated when meltwater lakes trapped behind ice dams broke free, reshaped valleys in short spans of time. Sediment layers found downstream from ancient ice margins record such events. Thick deposits laid rapidly over prior surfaces. For communities nearby, these floods posed immediate threat to camp and mobility routes. Ground near ice edges also shifted as buried ice melted beneath sediment, creating uneven terrain susceptible to collapse. Travel across such surfaces required discernment, as what appeared stable might conceal voids beneath thin crusts. Cold katabatic winds descending from ice domes intensified local weather, lowering temperatures and increasing wind chill in adjacent areas. The microclimate near glaciers could therefore diverge sharply from conditions only a short distance away. Despite these risks, archaeological evidence places human presence near glacial fronts at multiple sites across Eurasia. Stone tools, hearth remains, and fondal assemblages appear within sediments once adjacent to ice margins. Such findings suggest that people strategically occupied these zones, balancing hazard against access to concentrated resources. Seasonal use may have been common with camps, established during periods of relative stability, and abandoned when melt intensified. The edge of the ice sheets functioned as both threshold and resource nexus. It marked the limit of habitable terrain while simultaneously generating ecological niches, unavailable elsewhere. Communities attuned to its rhythms could harvest benefits while mitigating exposure. Within this shifting boundary, survival unfolded in close dialogue with a landscape that was never entirely still, where thaw and freeze negotiated daily the contours of possibility. Not every landscape yielded equally to the pressures of ice and wind. Within the broader austerity of the glacial world, certain regions retained pockets of relative stability, places where temperature, moisture, and terrain combined to soften extremes. These areas, often termed climate refugia, functioned as ecological anchors during intervals when surrounding territories grew inhospitable. Their existence shaped patterns of human persistence in ways subtle yet profound. Southern Europe offered one such constellation of refuges, shielded in part by mountain ranges and influenced by maritime air masses, portions of the Iberian Peninsula, southern France, Italy, and the Balkans maintained milder conditions compared to northern latitudes. Pollen records from lake sediments indicate continued presence of tree species in these species, while forests elsewhere retreated. Mixed woodlands, though altered in composition, provided diversified plant resources and moderated local microclimates. Rivers flowing through these southern corridors remained active year-round, supporting fish populations and attracting herbivores. Resource clustering amplified the value of these refuges, where fresh water, forage, and shelter converged within manageable distance. Human groups could establish repeated seasonal or even multi-generational occupation. Archaeological sites in southwestern Europe reveal thick cultural layers, accumulations of stone tools, hearth residues, and art objects that suggest continuity across long spans of time. Such density contrasts with thinner, more episodic deposits found in harsher regions, implying that refugia supported more stable demographic presence. Topography further contributed to resilience. Valleys protected from prevailing winds, coastal zones with access to marine foods, and karsted landscapes rich in caves created diverse niches within limited geographic areas. This heterogeneity buffered against localized failure. If one resource declined, another might remain available. The resulting flexibility reduced the need for constant long-distance migration, allowing communities to refine knowledge of specific territories over generations. Repeated habitation sites reveal patterns of return shaped by familiarity and accumulated fur experience. Tool assemblages display stylistic continuity, indicating cultural transmission within stable social networks. The persistence of symbolic expression in these regions, including elaborate cave art, may reflect not only psychological adaptation, but also demographic stability sufficient to support specialized activity beyond immediate subsistence. Refugia did not eliminate hardship. Winters still imposed constraint, and resource variability persisted. Yet compared to the advancing margins of ice or arid interior plains, these southern enclaves offered relative predictability. They acted as reservoirs of both biological diversity and cultural knowledge, sustaining populations through climatic oscillations within the broader narrative of glacial survival. Thriving did not mean abundance in the modern sense. It signified sustained viability, the capacity to endure without continual displacement. In these moderated landscapes, systems of food, acquisition, shelter, and social organization found firmer footing, allowing human presence to persist and radiate outward when conditions elsewhere permitted. Change did not announce itself with a single sunrise. It arrived incrementally, almost imperceptibly at first, in the timing of thaw and the lengthening of growing seasons. Across centuries, average temperatures began to climb, loosening the grip of continental ice. Glaciers that had advanced and stabilized for generations started to retreat, exposing raw ground where none had been seen within living memory. Vegetation responded cautiously, then with increasing confidence spreading into newly available soils. As ice sheets diminished, immense volumes of meltwater entered the oceans. This input did not occur evenly, but in pulses, episodes, when natural ice dams failed, or when sustained warming accelerated discharge. Geological evidence preserved in marine sediments and coral terraces indicates periods of rapid sea level rise superimposed upon broader gradual trends. Coastlines shifted landward, redrawing maps that had structured human movement for millennia. Rising seas submerged low-lying corridors, once used for travel and settlement. Broad plains that had connected land masses narrowed and eventually disappeared beneath expanding water. Archaeological traces now lie offshore, preserved beneath sediment on continental shelves. The flooding of these regions did not necessarily occur within a single generation, yet its cumulative effect altered migration routes and resource distribution. Communities that had relied upon coastal hunting and gathering adjusted to changing shorelines, relocating camps to higher ground or inland valleys. Ecological transformation accompanied these hydrological changes. As temperatures moderated, forests expanded northward, replacing open steppe in many regions. Tree species recolonized slopes previously dominated by cold-tolerant grasses and shrubs. Animal populations shifted accordingly. Some megafauna declined as their preferred habitats contracted, while other species adapted to emerging woodland environments. The composition of ecosystems reorganized in response to altered precipitation patterns and soil development on freshly exposed terrain. Ocean circulation patterns adjusted as freshwater influx modified salinity gradients, influencing climate in adjacent regions. These feedbacks occasionally introduced short-lived reversals within the overall warming trajectory, yet the long-term trend favored deglaciation. River systems recalibrated to new base levels as sea level rose, reshaping deltas and estuaries. Wetlands formed where meltwater pooled, creating novel habitats that attracted both wildlife and human attention. For human communities, the end of the deep freeze did not signify immediate ease. It required reinterpretation of familiar landscapes and recalibration of established routines. Knowledge accumulated during glacial conditions remained valuable, yet its application evolved within changing ecological frameworks. As ice withdrew and water advanced, the physical stage of survival transformed. The world did not simply warm, it reassembled itself, inviting new strategies while closing others, carrying forward the memory of cold, even as it yielded to a different equilibrium. Survival, viewed across the arc of glacial centuries, resolves into interlocking systems rather than isolated acts. No single skill sustained life on its own. Each element relied upon the others, forming a network that had to function continuously if small communities were to persist. When one strand weakened, strain traveled outward through the rest. Shelter formed the first boundary between body and environment. Whether carved from natural formations or assembled from bone, hide, and earth, it moderated exposure and conserved energy. Yet shelter without fire would have been insufficient. Flame transformed enclosed space into habitable refuge, stabilizing internal temperature, drying garments, preparing food, and deterring predators. Fire, in turn, depended on fuel acquisition and careful maintenance, tasks that required coordinated labor and foresight. Clothing extended protection beyond camp, converting fragile skin into layered insulation capable of enduring wind and sub-zero air. Its production demanded tools, raw materials, and time, linking garment construction to hunting success and social cooperation. Without adequate clothing, mobility would have narrowed, limiting access to distant herds or freshwater sources. Calories supplied the metabolic engine underlying every other system. Food procurement was not merely about satiation, but about sustaining thermorelation, cognitive clarity, and physical endurance. Fat-rich resources supported brain function and long-term energy storage, reinforcing the capacity to plan and adapt. Yet caloric intake fluctuated, requiring preservation strategies and shared distribution to buffer periods of scarcity. Cooperation wove these components together, hunting large prey, transporting materials, tending the injured, and caring for children, all exceeded the capacity of solitary individuals. Information about shifting climates and animal movements circulated within and between groups, strengthening resilience through shared knowledge. Social bonds functioned as infrastructure, redistributing risk and stabilizing morale under prolonged stress. Mobility allowed recalibration when local conditions deteriorated. Seasonal movement aligned human presence with ecological opportunity, while avoidance of advancing ice or depleted territories prevented collapse. Yet movement required preparation, lightened toolkits, and anticipation of future needs rather than reaction alone. Adaptability permeated each domain. Tools were repaired and redesigned, diets adjusted to available species, and shelters modified in response to wind and thaw. Environmental feedbacks introduced variability, and survival depended on interpreting these signals with precision. Planning beyond the next day distinguished persistence from short-lived success. Decisions were made not solely for immediate comfort, but for continuity across seasons and generations. In this integrated framework, survival was systemic equilibrium maintained against persistent pressure. Shelter, fire, clothing, calories, cooperation, mobility, and adaptability interacted continuously, forming a living architecture of response. Through this architecture, human communities endured climatic extremes, not by strength alone, but by sustaining relationships among interdependent parts, each reinforcing the others within a landscape that offered little margin for error. History rarely preserves the countless moments when failure almost arrived but did not. What endures instead is the trace of continuity, the thin thread of lives carried forward through intervals that could easily have closed across glacial millennia. Survival was not defined by unbroken triumph. It rested on margin, on narrow buffers maintained between exposure and protection, hunger and nourishment, isolation and belonging. Small communities moved through winters that stretched beyond ordinary reckoning. Cold seasons demanded precision in preparation and restraint in consumption. Supplies were measured not only against present need, but against the uncertainty of weeks still to come. When storms lingered or herds altered their routes, groups adjusted with deliberate care, preserving cohesion while recalibrating expectation. Endurance unfolded not as spectacle, but as repetition, sustained across days that resembled one another, yet required steady vigilance. Adaptation accumulated gradually, transmitted through memory and imitation. Techniques refined in one generation entered the habitual repertoire of the next. Materials were selected with discernment, pathways mapped against prevailing winds, seasonal rhythms internalized until they shaped instinct. Cultural evolution functioned as an instrument as tangible as any blade or shelter frame. Knowledge encoded in story, ritual, and practice provided orientation when landscape shifted or resources thinned. The shaping force of the Ice Age extended beyond immediate survival. It favored cooperation over fragmentation, planning over impulse, communication over silence. Decisions rarely concerned a single individual alone. Each action reverberated through kin networks, whose stability depended on reciprocity and shared foresight. Social bonds became adaptive structures, distributing labor and buffering risk. In this sense, resilience emerged from relationships as much as from physical capacity. Strength certainly mattered, yet strength isolated from system offered limited security. A skilled hunter required companions to process and distribute a successful kill. A proficient toolmaker relied upon steady access to materials gathered by others. A parent depended upon communal support during illness or scarcity. Survival crystallized within interconnected patterns that amplified individual ability into collective continuity across successive centuries of cold. These patterns solidified into durable traits: patience and planning, attentiveness to environmental cues, and willingness to cooperate beyond immediate self-interest. As climates moderated and ice withdrew, the habits forged under pressure did not vanish. They remained embedded within cultural frameworks, guiding responses to new challenges in altered ecosystems. The fragile line that led to present humanity was therefore not a sequence of heroic episodes, but an ongoing calibration between constraint and creativity. It was sustained by systems refined under relentless conditions, by knowledge shared rather than hoarded, by adaptation repeated until it became tradition. Those inherited systems continue to influence how communities organize, anticipate uncertainty, and coordinate action. Subtle legacies of an age when margin determined existence and continuity depended on shared resolve.